Okay, so what we're going to talk about is having your project and keep staying on track and keeping the stakeholders happy or on side. You don't want them worried because the stakeholders are the people that have something to win or lose from the project. And if they're a little bit uncomfortable, then they tend to create a bit of a hassle, and then they look for more information, and then you don't have time to give it, and so on. So it's much better to think in advance. What are they going to need? And to give it to them so that they don't jump on you a bit like that. And so obviously that means that the things that we see here is that we need to know where our project is at all the time. We can't say, oh yeah, let me just check on that type of thing. We really need to know, have a feel. The same as you do if you're driving a car, you're on the right side of the road and you've gone roughly a third of the distance and so on. And then to keep people aligned and informed, they might have insights. The stakeholders may have insights that such and such a thing is not happening. I saw a report yesterday of a railway train that ran into a bridge, and that particular route has no train for the next 24 hours. So if that was part of your project somehow, you have to allow for things like that. And what we're aiming at here is being proactive. So we're saying, think it through and give the stakeholders the information that they're likely to need so that as we move forward, the project will not get into that vicious circle where they feel uncomfortable, they ask for more information, it takes you time you don't have, and so on. So just to say, because this is going out to the world, this is one of a series of webinars. What we have is we have a series of 10 topics, which I'll show you in a few moments. And we take one of these every month and we offer it as a webinar so that you can brush up your skills if you like, and you can certainly interact with it as you go. And you can join anywhere in the cycle. You might join in number 3, for example, and stay for the next 10 or so until we get back to number 2. So that's one of this series. So just for the record, what Scatterwork does, we support people who have global challenges and to manage their success. So instead of just saying, oh, gee, what do I do now? You've got some sort of direction. So businesses need initiatives, or also known as assignments, projects, ventures, and so on, to implement their plan. So somebody says we need to make this product on a different production line in a different country, or we need to open this new product, or we need to adjust a product that's already out there. All of those sort of things are initiatives, projects. I'm not going to haggle about the word. And the challenge is, particularly if the thing that you're doing is very expensive, for example, you're building a motorway or something like that, or if it's particularly urgent, it just must happen very quickly if it's going to happen at all. Or if it's distributed, you might have a digitalization project and the data is in different continents. So that makes it more difficult. So it adds to the challenges. Or if it's global with different cultures, people understand each other differently. And you say, I said this, did you not agree? And they say, oh, no, you didn't say that. I thought you said something else, and so on. So any of these things here, and there are other things as well, which make life hard. Project management is a set of experiences that we can apply so that we can deliver managed success. That's what we're doing. Why engage with us? We operate at every level, from blue chip multinationals at the top end down to small and medium enterprises at the bottom, all like in the organizational levels. The badges you see there, they're all from big companies. If I put small ones, you probably wouldn't know who they were, but we have dozens of clients. And project management is something that goes across sectors. The thinking is the same in all sectors. So it's a bit like a bank. A bank has money, and then it has different types of clients. It has business people and farmers and investors and so on, but they all use money. And there are enough issues, if you like, of a generic nature in project management that we can have a useful contribution to our clients by looking at those levels of things that apply across the board. Just to give one example, if you're doing a project, how do you know that you were given authority to do it? And sometimes you find it was very informal. Another reason for working with us, we've worked in lots of countries over the years and physically in over 40 countries, but we've also obviously had events where some of our participants were in some countries that we haven't yet visited. So we have a 10 step-by-step framework. And these are the items that we're doing with our webinars. And this one here, Stay on Track, is where we're at today. And we take these are challenges, and how do you do it? And they apply to any project methodology, whether it's agile or predictive or so on. And there's a case study there. I won't spend time going through it, but the long and the short of it was that a client worked with us and he halved, like 50%, the cost of registration projects that he had in China. He was actually in Switzerland. And by putting together a plan and then sharing it with the clients and saying, oh, by the way, we think it would be fair if you paid for half of it, he had far more reliable project implementation than he did before the engagement. We've been around for a long time. I started off in the 1990s, which is in Ireland, and we're very sensitive to being able to deal with people in different places because of the cost of going anywhere. And so we've been working virtually, probably, maybe 20 years ahead of the curve. And our consultants all have PMP, Project Management Professional, very widely known accreditation from the Project Management Institute. Okay, so the event may be recorded, so I'm going to start the recording now, if that's okay. So where we're going now is into the content, and we're looking at staying on track and keeping your stakeholders on side. So there are two separate things there, really. One of them is where actually is your project, and the other is convincing people. So it might be that your project is doing very well, but for whatever reason, they don't understand, they're not convinced, and that can be a bit of a problem sometimes. For successful delivery, to know you're on track, and you have to have good communication with the people that you're dealing with. And until you start getting results out of your project, you have to sort of send good, happy messages. We're on track and so on, but they have to be credible, because it's very easy to say, oh yeah, we're on track, and then all of a sudden you're not. And then you get a reputation for not being very reliable, as it were, on tracking. But until you start getting a result, then good communication is probably the most important thing to focus on. A project manager has a project, and the CEO in a company, one of the things they have to do is to look after the outside reputation and interaction with politics and business in the region and all those sort of things. And they also have an internal role to make things happen through the operations. And very often you have a separate operations manager who does that. So it's a bit the same for a project. And this model has a look at this module. We're looking at how stakeholders will interact with all of that. So here are a few challenges that I've met on my times. Keeping the stakeholders on side in the football sense and the game sense, that you don't want to catch them and find that they feel, man, that's funny, they should have told me, or I got caught out or something like that. If you generate that sort of a feeling, or if it happens, even if you don't intend it, it can be very negative for a project. So for tracking progress, we have to write it down. And of course, nobody really likes to spend time on documenting. They think, yeah, I know what I'm doing, just get out of my way while I do it. But in most projects, you're dealing in a bigger organization, or you've got clients who are in big organizations, and they want to know when things are going to come. That's a big issue. There has to be some sort of formalized documentation, and it has to be more or less the same format for all projects. Otherwise, it would be hard to interpret. Here's another challenge. The culture of the most senior person influences the entire organization. So if you have an organization where the boss is not easy to get on with, shall we say, then you probably find that the people in his team will act that way as well, or her team. If people are working from home office, you obviously have limited personal contact. So some people that I'd love to talk to, I would think, if I worked in the same office, I'd just go for a coffee break at the same time and then say, hey, by the way, I'm doing this and this. But if you're at a distance, you don't have these opportunities. And then, of course, the world is very unstable. So these are all sorts of challenges. And of course, there are lots of other ones. So our first thing is going to be finding out who the stakeholders are and then engaging with them. Okay, so the very first question is, who are they? And a really good way of finding this out is to go to the people who give you the resources. You could call it a steering committee or senior management or whatever it is, and ask them, who do they think that the key stakeholders are? And then you add the names that you think, and then you go to those people and ask them the same thing. And what tends to happen is after 2 or 3 times asking the question, you end up getting the same answer. So the list stabilizes. So that's a really good way. There are other ways, of course, of doing it with checklists, and you can go to your organization chart, and so on. But asking the actual stakeholders of a project is a good way. And then when you've done that, the next thing is, what's their influence and interest? We tend to focus on the people who can influence our work. A boss, they can tell you what to do, or they can withhold holidays, or insist that you use a particular approach or something like that. And so we need to know do they have strong or weak influence? I had a guy one time, and he had been in the company about 40 years. He was a technician, and he had been working with the guy who founded the company years and years back. So they were very pally, and they had been very a long time together. So his influence was very high. But on the organization chart, he was just somebody at the bottom somewhere. He was the technician, and somewhere at the top, you had the manager. But actually, he had a very big influence. And what do they need and expect? Some people are going to say, don't bother me unless something goes wrong. And other people are going to say, give me a one-page summary every day. I had a boss one time, and he used to say, before you go home, just pass my office and just tell me how the day went. So obviously, it prevented you going home early, because you didn't want to go around to the boss and say, I'm going off early today. Even people who started very early in the summer, and it was perfectly legitimate. And then if you've got nothing to report, then that's good. And if you do have it, maybe your boss will give you some thoughts. So here's some ways to engage with people like this. Give them free access to the information. It could be for these days, of course, a lot of what a project has done is in a database somewhere. So instead of saying, I give you a weekly report or something like that, just give them access to the database. And normally it's not going to be very much what you might call confidential information inside database. And anyway, if there is, you're all probably working for the same company and have the same rules and so on. Communicate regularly and transparently on person-to-person issues. You might do this, you might arrange to meet your boss once a week for lunch or something like that. And in a sort of private environment, you can mention things that would be difficult otherwise. The messages depend on the audience. And in particular, individuals will have particular styles. So if you've got a very dominant type of stakeholder somewhere, and they say, like my boss, I want you to come to my office every day, then you really have no choice but to do that. You may be able to suggest something else, but they might say, yeah, I'd really be happy if you did come. And we need different messages. Sometimes we want a lot of detail, sometimes less, depends on the person. So there are a lot of different ways of doing it. One boss I had one time, his way of doing it was on the golf course. He used to play golf on Sundays. And a lot of the people I was working with at the time, they were also there on Sundays. And I said, hey, what's happening? What do you think we should do about this? And that was another way of engagement. It wasn't just meetings and apps and things like that. So once we found out who the stakeholders are, then a next area that I want to look at is building credibility with them. Because, as I say, if somebody thinks you're really good, they let you get on with the job. If they're not very sure, they'll ask for extra information. And very often they'll ask for it when you don't have any capacity to pull out the information. And then that puts you under pressure. And then you make a mistake and so on. And then they think, aha, I knew they weren't all that much under control. And look, they've done such and such. So if you can build up, what would you call it, a reputation, if you like, that you're credible and that you're trustworthy and that what you say goes and so on, if you do, then that will make life a lot easier. And the very first advice would be listen more than you talk. I knew a guy one time, and he was responsible in principle for a group of engineers that were installing telephones around the world and telephone systems and so on. And actually, what he used to do was to spend all his time on the phone, just calling the guys and say, hey, well, how was it yesterday? And the guy would say, oh, you wouldn't believe what happened yesterday, blah, 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 blah. And he just used to listen. It's terribly simple. And then if you do that, then people think, and rightly, that you're interested in what they're doing. So it's a terribly simple technique. And again, I find it's very cultural. I come from a culture where people talk a lot. And then there are other cultures where people talk louder or less louder or even not at all. be reliable and predictable and so on. So, for example, if you say to somebody, I'll bring you in the handbook tomorrow so that you can look at it, don't forget it. It's trivial for you, but you did, and they're waiting for you to fulfill the promise. And be open about challenges. I had a boss one time and he used to say, just tell the truth. If something is, for example, late on delivery, you say the way that it's going, it looks as though it's going to be delivered on such and such a date. And when they say, that's no good, we must do something. The best answer I find to that, and it works in lots of countries, is just to say, if you go into words, you start getting into a row about it and what can you do about it. But sometimes things happen and you actually genuinely can't avoid them. So here's some things we can do to improve trust. And remember, we're talking here about this whole section about keeping stakeholders on side. And so it's a very human focused thing. It's not the answer is not to have lots of apps and messages and things like that. The thing is to focus on the human side, which is what we've been doing up until now. So share successes and lessons learned. So lessons learned is very often we did this and it didn't work out very well. That's good because then if you learn that, then you can use it the next time. If you ask the stakeholder for what they think, what's their opinion and what's their input, they'd be, on the one hand, they'd be flattered, and then they feel, oh yeah, this person is interested. So if you do your active listening and you ask questions about, hey, what do you think about such and such, and then they tell you and you listen actively, then that will help build up trust usually. Be responsive. So if they make a side comment and you say, is there anything else? They say, no. Ah, accept. And then the little accept thing might be something that actually takes quite a bit of effort to respond to. But you could take a note and say, yeah, note your comment on that. I'm going to have a look at it. Listening actively and be accountable for your own stuff. Don't say it wasn't me. I find that happens to a lot of people. You say, we need to do this, that, and the other. They say, I can't do it. And the answer is, I'm not asking you to do it. I'm just asking you, how are we going to do things? Okay, so I spent quite a lot of time there on stakeholders themselves. And what I'm going to do now is move on to tools and techniques, if you like, for tracking itself so that you have something to tell them. So why does it matter? And this is my opinion of the most important reason. When you do a project, when you've done a particular item, whatever it might be, a particular deliverable, you put it on the table and somebody else takes it and uses it to do whatever they want to do. So what they want to do, they want to know when they're going to get it. And then if it comes when it was expected, then that's okay. And they need just to know that, yeah, if you give me a time, it will happen. So my example, living in Switzerland, is the railways. The railways run within, I don't know, a minute or two of the timetable. And about 3 or 4 minutes before a train is due, people come to the platform. Before that, the place is empty. I live in a village, and the platform is empty until the train is nearly due. And then if it comes on time, then everyone gets on it. And if it's more than about 2 minutes late, everyone looks at their watches. So it's not a fast train, but it's predictable. And I think that's one of the reasons, because people put huge effort in. They say, we got our team ready to do whatever it was. You're building a roadway and you hand it over to the people who are going to operate the roadway or something. And they got everything ready. And then you said, oh, I'm really sorry, we're going to be 3 weeks late. You want your stakeholders as well to send positive messages out in their network. So they might be at some sort of meeting that you're not at yourself, and you want them to feel very confident. So if they think, I don't really know what's going on, I'm not really sure the thing is on track and all that sort of thing, then they're inclined not to say it. And then the people who want to know the thing, obviously in that project, they don't know what's happening, and you're into that vicious circle again. Another reason that we do real-time tracking is that if something goes wrong, we want to find out quickly. So if there's something, I was on a motorway recently, actually, and I was going out the city, and for the first hour or so, the traffic was really slow. And what actually happened was that there was a car broken down in the fast lane, about, I don't know, 20, 30 kilometers out of the city. And because it was on the fast lane, obviously you couldn't have the motorway running the normal way. But the effect of it went all the way back. But there was no sign saying, oh, car on the carriageway. And you would think if you were managing that motorway, probably the most important thing would be to get the car off that. Just lift it off and put it on the side of the road. But you didn't want to find out an hour later after driving very slow. If you track properly, people these days, everything is data driven. In the old days, people would do things by hunch. But these days, people are much more data driven when, how long and how often this happens and how often it doesn't work properly and so on. And then, of course, to make sure that you stay on schedule and within scope. But even there, it could be that there are things in the real world that prevent you delivering on schedule. There could be an accident somewhere, for example, and people are not available, or some equipment can't travel because the road is blocked or something like that. So you can't always deliver bang on schedule, and you don't want the scope to change without knowing it. So here's a tip, if you like, for management. Make sure that you know the project status and then communicate it. So if you're doing well, don't be afraid to say that. Okay, so I'm moving on now to communication itself. One thing is the people, the stakeholders, who are they and how do we interact? And another one is the actual data. What is your progress? But now I'm talking about the communication of that issue. And the things that people like to know, they really want to know, in my experience, they want to know, am I going to get whatever it was when you said, and at that price? So they don't want surprises. They don't want to get it on time, but it cost twice what you expected. And they don't want it 10% later, but you didn't know until you got there and so on. People like predictability so that they can plan their own work based on it. So progress, issues, risks, and maybe projected end date of a phase or whatever is probably what people are looking for. So when we're formulating, this is us talking about the situation. As I said, until now, we were talking about who are the stakeholders on the one hand and what is the actual process. But here we're talking about the way of getting this message across. So we need to be clear and concise, and that makes it much easier to read. I saw a letter a couple of years ago, and somebody wanted a new part for some system or other, and the part was made in Italy. And they wrote this letter and they said, dear so-and-so, we have one of these machines, but it's not working at present. Could you please send me one of those parts there? Da, 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 da. And what they should have done, in my view, was to write a letter and just say, please send one of, and then name the part. Try and be very simple. There are all sorts of visual aids, but within project management, there are a number of standard ones, and I'll mention some of them later on, or dashboards, which it's like the dashboard in the car. It has 4 or 5 different, or maybe half a dozen different things that are being measured, speed and how far you went since you last put petrol in and so on. And there are lots of ways of getting the message through, obviously. There's things like email, meeting, conference calls. I've mentioned dashboards. You can give access to a database. Instant messaging, I personally find that has positive and negative. So positive is you get the message straight away. The negative is you have to say, oh, what did that relate to? And you have to open up all your emails and find out where it goes. So it's both positive or negative. The communications, adapt them to preferences. So there are definitely preferences based on hierarchy and culture and company culture, national culture, and so on here. And unless you get something pretty close, it just won't trigger with the other people. And encourage feedback so that you can say to somebody, that's what I want you to. Just tell me again to check that we understood the same thing. So here's a few ways of keeping stakeholders aware. And I'm beginning to divide here between agile and predictive projects because they have a really different culture within the project. So the predictive project is the one where you know before you start what actually you're going to get at the end. So if you're going to make, I don't know, a railway train, and it's quite similar to ones you did before, And this one, it's going to be maybe different number of coaches, or maybe some of the fittings are different, or a different color or something like that. You can add these things in and you can be pretty accurate on your estimate, but it's predictive. Progress meetings, traditionally, once we had a meeting. Of course, these days you don't need that as much because a lot of that data just goes into a database, which I mentioned here. Weekly and monthly reports, that's fair enough. And then phase review. Predictive projects tend to run in phases. And one of the features of a phase review is that you're telling all the senior people who come, this is where we've got to. And then you'll be saying to them, and this is what we suggest we do for the next phase. And this is our plan and timing and costing and so for doing it. Oh, and by the way, here's the thing we've already achieved and it's finished. We've finished what we were supposed to do in the last phase. Do we have a go ahead? Phase review meeting is a way of keeping people in touch. And I say consultation, but that can be formal or informal. Obviously, you can play golf on a Sunday if you want, and that can be one very effective way of keeping in touch. Agile projects have a different culture, and one of the things about it is that everyone is the same level. Just because you're the boss, it doesn't mean you're more important. The technical people, they have an opinion about what's possible and what's not, and it's just as valid as a business one, and then you have to work around that. And one of the ways they get around that is by having a daily stand-up meeting, a short meeting, not to resolve the problems, but to find out who needs to talk to whom, and then as a separate meeting, they can go and have that meeting if they want to. Also, every iteration of the Agile project, they will have a review, or you could call it a sprint review, depends on which methodology you're using. I find it's very useful to have a table saying how you're going to do your communication. Stakeholders are the people you communicate with. The communication need, it could be that a particular stakeholder has 2 or 3 different needs, and maybe there are different methods of doing it. So, for example, my boss might want to know what's the mood in my team. And the boss might say, okay, I'll tell you what I'll do. I'll go around and meet the guys at their workplace and I'll ask them, hey, how's that guy Jasoon doing? But on the other hand, they might want to know what's the projected end date, and that would be much more formal. So you can see that they might have different needs and therefore different communication needs as well. And then when does it take place? It certainly will not work unless you give a particular time, Tuesdays at 7 o'clock and so on. The format could be meeting, could be informal, it could be, say, it could be golf course, it could be cup of coffee, web conference, whatever it might be. But if people are working in a distance from you, I would say take every possible opportunity to meet them personally. If they happen to be in your office for some reason or another, make sure you go out with them for lunch and so on. How are we going to actually communicate the information? A dashboard, as I say, you can have several different things on it, just like on a car, and they're very easy to do. I'll give you an example. Excel will draw graphs based on a table. And then the graphs, you can put them all on the one page so that you can see them. And then you can send a link so people can look at them. And if you do that, then the data in the background, as you update that, whether it's done automatically or manually, will show up on the dashboard. And we have a webinar actually that goes into that topic for anyone who's interested. Milestones, as I say, I think a milestone is very often the handover point between 2 different operators. So you're designing, let's say, a house, and the architect designs it and then gives the drawings over to the building people. And the milestone is the time when that happens. And some of the graphics that we use, I've just listed them here. You probably know most of them. And because we've only an hour here, I didn't put all of them in. Otherwise, it would just take too long to go through them all. But you can check them very easily on the internet. But a burn down chart is used in the agile world. If you're in a particular iteration and you're basically, when are we going to finish? Are we going to do everything we expect you to do? A burn up chart could be used per release. It says how many user stories we have to implement and so on. But that might change while the project is going ahead. And between one release and another, it might change. Kanban and so on. And earned value management is very much useful for predictive projects. It's quite complicated to get the ideas behind it, but once you get the ideas, it's a very useful approach. So I want to talk about the difference between agile projects and waterfall or predictive projects, and how they're going to affect us keeping things on track and communicating that. So agile tends to be, it's iterative. And as you do, you work in iteration in a cycle, and the cycle might be, shall we say, 3 weeks. And what that means is that every time somebody comes and says, "Oh, I think here's something new, we need to take this into account," you're never more than 3 weeks away from a meeting where it's going to be looked at. Now, during a sprint or an iteration, you don't change the rules. People don't appreciate that, and then you don't get anywhere either. But if you say, we've got a meeting coming up, yeah, it's only in 2 weeks. Yeah, tell me about it. We can see how to fit this new information into the project. Predictive or waterfall projects, they tend to have longer phases. So you have a phase review meeting, and the big people, the big important people turn up at that meeting, and then they go away for several weeks, and then they turn up again. You've got less communication between the project and the customers, and the period between reporting is longer. So both of those are negative. And of course, it often happens that they go away and they come back and they say, I was expecting blah, blah, blah. And not only did we get something else, but it took longer. What's going on around here? So I think it builds up that. And the agile approach of having a check of where you've got to every, for example, every 3 weeks is a really good way of doing it. So if you're with Agile, there are other things you can do for helping the tracking. They have these daily stand-up meetings that we mentioned. You have a review every sprint of the work that was done. And then you've got the backlog, all the other things that you would like to do. And grooming the backlog means that you're going through this list the whole time and adjusting, saying, yeah, that's more important. This should be split into two, and so on. All of that sort of discussion. It doesn't activate the implementation, but it means that when you're doing the iteration planning, and if something is ready for implementation, you say, we've already defined it, this is it. But the actual grooming doesn't interact directly with the delivery. In waterfall, you've got phase review meetings and so on that we mentioned. And it could be that a project has a mixture of things like this. For example, research projects that are funded by the European Union, they will have very specific dates for applications. But when you're actually doing the research, you can't, it's not predictive. If it were, you wouldn't need research. So in research, by definition, you're much more into an agile mode. Okay, as I mentioned before, when you start a project and do it before you start getting results where people can say, we've done this and we've done that, and you've got something that's really good, let me show it to you, and all that. Before you get there, the only thing you can do is communicate. And no news is bad news. In other words, if you don't communicate, the people at the other end, they will think, oh, Jeannie, what's gone wrong? And then they get very annoyed and so on. So it's probably much, much better to keep in touch with people far more often than you might otherwise think is absolutely necessary. But if you're doing that, of course, the project manager must know if or whether the project is on track. So what happens with Agile is that you have a product owner, and the product owner works with everybody to prioritize the backlog, so that every time there's a new iteration, we say, these are the top 3 or 4 things we want to do now. And they might be different from last week. And if you came next week, it might be different. But right now, these are the ones we want to do. And then, as I say, you've got the backlog. And then the release plan is, when are we going to actually put our product, whatever it is, on the market, and what sort of release are we going to do it all at once, or are we going to have a release and then a tidy up release 6 months later, and so on. Predictive is far more complicated. You get the stakeholders and they're in a steering committee, and then they have things like charter and objectives and requirements and risk and all this sort of thing. And the phase review meetings of the steering committee, if you like, They want to formalize the progress with reference to documentation. Where are we? Are we on track and all that stuff? And then there are also the people that make significant decisions, but they don't meet every week. So Agile actually has a much better approach in the sense that it makes decisions relatively often. Okay, when a change request, if somebody says they want to change, it's a request until it's actually agreed. Now, some people think it's an assignment. I've had situations where earlier in my career, my boss would have said to me, do this. And I think, oh, that sounds like an order, so I'd better do it. And then in retrospect, from where I am now, I look back and I say, I should have told them, oh, that's a request. We'll have to put it into the pipeline, and which means that you may or may not get an answer. But people, if they have a reason to change, they want you to understand the message. So the product owner, this is the agile approach. In the project, the product owner keeps touch with everybody involved and then says, okay, these are the items we'd like you to do in the next iteration. So it's relatively straightforward. And the predictive approach, somebody says they want to change, then you have to check the impact before you do anything, and then only allow benefit changes if they bring a benefit. And if they're authorized, then you need to do the plan before you implement it. Obviously, you need to put the plan together and say, this is going to be the plan if we go ahead. And sometimes people say, oh, that's too long or it's too complicated or whatever. If there are new change requests, we put them on a database of live requests. And very often we would have the change control board. We would have a look at this once a week to see what needs to happen and decide how a thing is to be assessed. And it could be, for example, they say, okay, we'll do that. Or it could be they say, we need more information, and they send it back again. And it goes around. But you need to do that regularly so that you don't have a big buildup of things that don't get done. This is the typical predictive approach. You log it, and then you check the impact, and then you have this decision with the change control board. It's either yes or it's no. But in Agile, they focus a lot on the relationship with the client, which is really nice. And we try and respond to things as they happen. We don't tell people, oh, we're sorry, we can't change them. And as I said, I think the trick is that because they have short iteration cycles, then if somebody has a change request of some sort, you don't have to undo work. You just feed it into the next decision. On the predictive side, this is what I've really just said with the graphic here, was you assess the impact. You find different ways of meeting it. And then you say, if we do it this way, it's probably okay. This way, if we did it this way, it wouldn't be so good. And then if the decision is made, then we communicate. We have to tell people, okay, we've looked at it and we're doing it or we're not doing it. And so if there are changes, we have to document them and then track what happens and update everything so that people can look at it and see where things have got to. And we're back to the stakeholders here. So we're near the end now. At the end, there's a couple of things here that we might have as challenges. Tracking progress in complex projects. And if it's agile, it's relatively straightforward. You have your roadmap and release plan, and you move forward. People can see the progress. And of course, if you're behind time in agile, the person who chooses what to do is the product owner, because they can actually decide, we'll do this instead of this, or we'll apply more resources or something like that. They can do that. So if you like, it's in their own hands. Difficult stakeholders. Yeah, we all know that. It can make it very hard when you're doing your job. And yeah, I'm not so sure what the good advice there is, but in the worst of cases, you have to move people around so that they don't bump off each other. Maybe moving one person to a different department or even to a different job. Something unexpected. So we all know you can have earthquakes and you can have elections and you can have riots and whatever it is, you can have things that can literally change in half an hour. So that makes it that much more difficult for us. So this is my very last advice slide. And what we're saying here is when you decide what you're going to do on all of these particular points, write them down. And a really good place to put them is in this handbook, project handbook, from the methodology PM squared. It's a European Union thing. It's intended to combine all the other methods, but to be very simple. And it's extremely well documented and it's free. So if you download a template, the template actually has instructions for how to use it. So you don't even have to tell people. You can just say, here's the template. Please follow the instructions. So it's a really good way of capturing. And we've been talking about stakeholders. How are we going to interact, keep them happy, provide them information and so on? And we focused on who they are. We focused on the actual status of the project. And then we focused on the actual way you're going to communicate this stuff. And these are all different issues. So what have we learned? So I'm going to turn off the microphone there. And thanks for stopping with us.